Okay, so hello, and this is the first lecture for our introduction to genetics. Over the next couple chapters, we will be taking a look at genetics, the practical application of genetics, and we'll talk a bit about DNA, how it's structured, and how that genetic structure translates into genes and chromosomes and reproduction and how traits get passed on and all that other really great stuff that DNA does. But to start with, we're going to be talking about genetics. That is the scientific study of heredity. And right here we have a big giant, what's called a phylogenetic, or not a phylogenetic tree, but a pedigree. And this basically looks a lot like a family tree because essentially what it is. We've got males and females on here, and we can see how they hand down certain traits to individuals. And we can see these two individuals here had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 offspring. And if we knew that some of these people had a particular trait, and we wrote down who had that trait, we could kind of track how that trait was handed down through multiple generations to see if it was a dominant trait or recessive trait. Here's another example of that for a particular disease, neurofibromatosis. And it looks like this individual, John James, had that disease. He and his wife had 5 children, and 2 of them inherited that particular disease. Of those, only you can see here that 1 of these 2 offspring inherited that, and 2 of these 3 offspring inherited it. And so we can see that these 2 individuals did not have that disease, and they did not hand that down to their offspring. So it's kind of interesting that when you start studying genetics, you can track different recessive or dominant traits, diseases, so forth through multiple generations. As a side note, you may have seen something like this in maybe some of your agriculture classes. Agriculture is really about controlling reproduction of organisms, whether that's crops or animals, because in agriculture, you only want the organisms with the traits that you like to reproduce. If you want white cows, you only let your white bull breed your stock. You don't just breed with a black or a red bull. If you want a particular type of this. People have understood all of this for a really long time, that things are handed down like that. I mean, that's how agriculture started thousands of years ago. We're going to get started here with some guy named Gregor Mendel, and you may have heard of him before. He's kind of remembered as the father of modern genetics because he figured out some of the rules that guide the transmission of traits through multiple generations. Now, we know it happens. I mean, obviously, from very get-go, people understood that things are handed down from parents to offspring. I mean, that's pretty obvious. But he was the first one that is credited with really tracking it scientifically and determining some of the underlying rules that guide it. The interesting thing is he was a monk and a teacher. And he was in Austria, and so he lived in a monastery. And he was in charge, or had some plots in the garden where he took care of some of the plants. And he's really remembered for breeding peas. And he learned a lot by breeding peas. I know that sounds really exciting, but it worked out pretty good. And once he figured out some of these rules that governed these genetics, he wrote about them in journals, and he actually was not credited with that till after his death. Someone discovered those and published them. So in his lifetime, he didn't get any credit for this, but now we remember him quite often. And so when we start talking about Gregor Mendel and studying pea plants, it's like, well, that's really not really that awesome, but it is. So what he did was he used pea plants to determine how traits are passed down through generations. He wanted to understand exactly how this works. And the question is, why pea plants? Well, there's multiple reasons why he picked a really great thing to study. For one, pea plants are true breeding. which means if you take a purple flowering pea plant and plant it, it would make purple flowering pea plant offspring. It wasn't random. If you've ever, bred some animals or plants, they might not all be exactly the same. Like you can have multiple colors of cats come out of the same parent cat or whatever. So he picked something that was always true breeding. If you planted a white flowering pea plant, it made white flowering pea plants. If you, depending on whatever trait you picked, it made exactly the same. He could also, with pea plants, control fertilization. So what he could do is control, I want to cross this particular plant with this particular plant. And because of that, he could then manipulate how those plants bred rather than it being some sort of random mixture. To do this, it's fairly easy. People still use the exact same method today. You get a paintbrush, you go up to the plant, and you get some pollen on your paintbrush, and you go to the other plant, and you take and you pull off the pollen producing parts of that plant and brush the female part of the plant with the pollen, and now you have controlled cross-pollination. It won't be able to then pollinate itself. So he could control this, and he did a lot of crosses by hand, crossing different types plants with different traits. So what he did was he took all these different true breeding plants that he had these distinct characteristics, and he mixed them up. And he wanted to see what was going to happen. The other reason this worked out really great is that pea plants can reproduce very rapidly. So if he picked something like cows, because we've got all these different kinds of cows, he would have to breed a bull to a cow. The cow would have to wait, have the baby finally, X number of months later, and then he'd have to let that offspring, go for a couple years before it could breed and see what kind of offspring it would produce. So with peas, he could have 3 generations in one growing season. So you could have a first generation, plant those seeds from that generation, have a second generation, and then plant those seeds and have a third generation. So he could have multiple generations of pea plants. So that was very, very helpful for this. Plus, peas don't run away from you. They don't get loose, and, they don't require a lot of work. So he picked something really great. So he took all these different traits of these pea plants, as you can see on this slide, whether what shape the seed was, what color the seed was, what color the flower was, what color the pea pods were, what the shape of them were, where they had their flowers, were they tall, were they short, and he totally took those and he started crossing them. So let's say you would cross a purple and a white flowering pea plant. What's going to happen? Well, conventional wisdom would say, well, would they mix? Well, what he found was that they didn't. So he hybridized these. So this term hybrid means crossing different traits. So he hybridized purple and white flowers. He hybridized yellow and green seeds. He hybridized, round and wrinkled seeds. And then once he crossed them, he took those seeds from that generation and planted those to see what he would get. So let's say he planted his purple, or took his purple and crossed with whites. He took them, crossed them, got the seeds. We might think they would be pink. He planted them, they were all purple. Crazy. But then he took that pollen, or that seeds from that generation, let it pollinate itself, and planted it again. And lo and behold, some of those offspring were white. So he started asking the question, how does this work? When I cross a purple and a white, I get all purple. But in the next generation, some of the whites start to appear. And he did some counting on this, and he found out that in that F2 generation, which we call our second filial generation, or his second generation from the originals, that he always had this 3-to-1 ratio of those traits that were hidden in that first generation that reappeared in that second offspring generation. It happened the same every single time. This really helped him, realize that, hey, when I cross this purple and this white, the white doesn't go away. It's just hidden, and it's able to, if it gets rearranged in a certain way, it reappears and I can see it again. Now, this might make sense to you because in your family, you might have some sort of particular trait, some sort of facial feature or something that's distinctive to maybe one side of your family that might skip a generation or skip a couple generations. Like your parents might not have this trait, but maybe your grandparents have this trait. That's because some traits can be hidden for a generation or two before they reappear. So this is what he figured out. By counting all of the number of dominant traits that always appeared and recessive traits that only appeared at some time or could be receded or hidden for a period of time, he was able to make some conclusions about this. So he said that inheritance is determined by factors passed down from one generation to the next. Now, we already knew this. Everyone knew this. But we call those factors genes. So we know that genetics, we hand down genes from parents to offspring. What Mendel figured out that there are different forms of the same gene that he called allele, like purple flower, white flower. Both controls the flower color. So those are alleles. They control the same thing. They're in a pair. They don't have to be the same, or they could be the same. Also, those different forms can be dominant and they can be recessive. So I could inherit the dominant form from my parent. Like if I have a purple and a white, purple is dominant. He knew that first offspring inherited purple and white because he cross-pollinated, yet they were all purple. Why? Well, he determined that those pair of alleles that got inherited, genes, one was dominant. It was always going to dominate or take over or control what he would see. All of the offspring were purple, every last one of them. They didn't mix. It was complete dominance. It said, I'm going to be shown. Well, but then the next generation, some of those recessive ones appeared, and some of the plants were totally white, but only about 25%. So he determined that pairing, once he repaired those up by letting them cross-pollinate themselves, they would pair up in such a way that you would have two recessive alleles together, and then that gene or allele could be expressed at that point, right? So he figured this out. He knew nothing about genetics. He knew nothing about DNA, but he did figure out that there are different forms of this factor that get inherited called alleles. They come in pairs. And we know that now that you get one gene from your mother, one gene from your father. They interact, and depending on whether they're the same or different and which one's dominant and which one's recessive, you will get that particular trait. Now, humans have about 21,000 different genes, so that's a lot. You get 21,000 from your mother, 21,000 from your father. They pair up, and then they start to interact, and that determines dominant or recessive. And based on that, you get the traits you have. Mendel figured this out without knowing anything about DNA, which is really super cool. So what that allows us to do is actually use what Mendel taught us to create these Punnett squares, which you've probably done before, and be able to predict the probability by which an offspring is going to be, produced. So let's look at some examples here. Let's say I have green pods and I have yellow pods. Now I'm using the letter G just to represent this one particular trait, which is green or not green, in this case yellow. We use the same letter to represent it, and we typically use a capital letter to represent the dominant allele and the lowercase letter to represent the recessive allele. So here I crossed a green pea plant with a yellow pea plant. Now this pea plant was carrying a pair of green or capital G and lowercase g, but it expressed or showed the dominant one, which was I have to be green. This one was yellow because it did not have a green gene saying you have to be green. It doesn't have that dominant allele. So whenever we crossed this plant, this parent, with this parent here could either contribute a capital G or lowercase g. This parent could only contribute a lowercase g or lowercase g. So when we did our cross, we bring this one down here and down there, same here, and then we carry this one across this way and this one across this way. And we see that in this case, this parent, these peas are all going to be green because they have that dominant you must be green allele. Same here. These two offspring are going to be yellow. Now, this is the probability. It doesn't guarantee, because of how reproduction works, that you're going to inherit this one and then that one and this one and then that one. It just means overall you have a 50% chance of inheriting that green gene. Otherwise, you'll inherit the recessive yellow gene, and it will pair up in such a way that you will have yellow pods. In this case, you've got the pollen from the male up here, which is carrying a dominant and a recessive, and this is the female, which donates a dominant and recessive. And what you end up with is I donate a big B here, a big B there, same across here. Little b gets donated and little b gets donated there and there. So I end up with, this is actually what Mendel did, and he ended up with this one out of those four being white and showing that recessive trait, which is to be white, and was not masked by that dominant big B trait, which is to be purple. Let's say we could use any letter to represent this. You can use any letter you want. It doesn't matter the letter. What matters is that it's capital or not capital, dominant, recessive. This one is dominant, and it's got a big B. It's also going to donate that dominant allele to, no matter what, to its offspring one way or the other. These two individuals have one of each allele. When you have one of each allele, a dominant and recessive, that is referred to as being heterozygous. Hetero means different, like heterotrophic, some different form of food or energy. You got to go find it, right? So heterozygous means you have two different potential alleles you could donate genetically. This one that has two of the same, we would call homozygous. Homo means the same, like homogenized milk. Okay, it's blended to be the same throughout. This one is also known as homozygous. We would call this one homozygous dominant, this one homozygous recessive. You only get to show the recessive trait if you're homozygous recessive. These two pea plants are homozygous recessive. This is homozygous recessive. These two offspring are heterozygous, as are these two offspring. Okay, we'll see more Punnett squares later on. Let me just show you a larger one. In this case, these types of Punnett squares are called monohybrid crosses. Remember, hybrids are when you cross things. Mono means one, so a monohybrid cross is where you cross one trait. In this case, the only trait we're looking at is pod color. In this case, the only trait we're looking at is flower color. Let me show you a dihybrid cross. So here is a dihybrid cross. So in this case, we are looking at the color of the pea, and we're looking at wrinkled or not wrinkled. And so in this case, we take all the potential outcomes. So if this parent is big R, little r for round, and big Y, little y for yellow or not, for color, and this parent is big R, and big Y, we end up with, so it'd be big R, big Y, little y. We have two different traits we're looking at the same time. So all of a sudden this gets really complex, and this is all your potential outcome. So if I cross those two traits, the greatest chance of a particular offspring would be yellow and round. I have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 out of 16 chance, or 50% chance of having a round yellow pea when I made this cross. And those are the dominant traits, so that kind of makes sense. What's the least common one? Well, to have a green wrinkled pea, I would only have a 1 in 16 chance of getting this particular trait, right? So you can imagine that this is just two traits, two alleles, two genes. We have 21,000 genes. So most of those are the same, but there's enough differences in humans that if you made a Punnett square for a human and everything that could be different, it'd be really huge and really complex, and there'd be all these different possible outcomes you could get. That is why you don't look the same maybe as your brother or sister. You had this whole huge thing that you could pull from for all these different traits, right? So this is pretty cool that you can predict how your offspring are going to end up. Once again, to come back around and to conclude here, in agriculture, you might have seen this before in an ag class, because farmers, people who grow things, want to know what kind of offspring they're going to have, so they control the parentage. Now, in this case, they could even predict, like if you raised dogs or something and you knew what traits you had, you could know that you could potentially get this one set kind of trait, and you might breed over and over until you get that trait, if you know it's possible. And so this really allows us to breed all these different cool animals, just knowing that it's possible and using what we learned from Mendel to predict what the probability of that outcome is going to be. Okay, we'll stop there, and we'll pick up with how this plays into actual reproduction and the influence it has on reproduction next lecture. Thanks.